The hearing was postponed until the 11th of October to give the prosecutor time to prepare the information which should serve as an indictment and which had not yet been formally presented nor made a matter of record. In the meantime, public attention must have been greatly attracted to the proceedings as they were progressing, and invitations went out to all persons who had lost children by abduction within the specified time and who had reason to suppose the crime could be laid to Gilles or his accomplices to present themselves before the court and make their complaints. Le Maire relates this incident, quote, "On the 10th of October, a herald at arms of the Duke of Brittany, bearing his livery, sounded the trumpet 3 times before the chateau, and then, in a loud voice, demanded that any person having knowledge of the affairs of Gilles de Rais was summoned to appear before the court and tell what he knew under pain of fine and imprisonment. No person responded to this appeal." So great was the number appearing the next day in response to this notification that the court was unable to proceed with the trial, and consumed the 11th and 12th in its inquest, hearing and recording complaints of the many witnesses. As we have seen, these witnesses were presented before the judges, interrogated, and their statements taken down in the form of depositions, to the end that they might be included in the information against the prisoner. On October 13th, having finished this work, the court had the prisoner brought before it. The session of the court was held in public. The bench appears to have been filled with ecclesiastical dignitaries, many of them bishops from the neighboring dioceses, with lawyers and judges. While below, an immense pressing, pushing, exasperated crowd of bereaved parents and friends, filled with emotion, added much to the excitement by their declarations of the losses they had sustained by the abduction of their dear children, and who filled the room with their cries against the perpetrator of the crimes by which they had been robbed of their loved ones. The hour for opening was, as usual, 9 o'clock. The first business was a return to the question of the plea to be filed by the accused. Gilles refused with great hauteur than before, and pushed his refusal disdainfully, ending by becoming abusive of the judges and officers of the court, and conducting himself in a highly improper and insulting manner. The following extracts are from the verbal process of the audience. Quote, "On the above-mentioned Thursday, the 13th of October, there appeared in the court before the Lord Bishop of Nantes, the aforesaid promoter, asked the aforesaid Gilles de Rais, the accused, whether he wished to reply to the positions and articles against him, or whether he wished to say anything against them, or to take any exception to them. He answered with pride and haughtiness that he wished to give no answer to the positions and articles, asserting that the aforesaid lords, the bishop and vice-inquisitor, were not his judges, that he appealed from them, speaking irreverently and improperly. Moreover, the aforesaid Gilles de Rais accused and then said that the aforesaid lords, the Bishop of Nantes and the brother Jean Blun, the vicar of the aforesaid inquisitor, and all other ecclesiastical men were guilty of simony and were ribalds, and that he would rather be hanged by the neck than to answer before such ecclesiastics and judges, feeling it a grievance to have to appear before them. And finally, addressing the Lord Bishop, he said in the vernacular, Je ne ferai rien pour vous comme évêque de Nantes. Then, under pain of excommunication, he was asked to reply to the charges made against him, but he refused, saying that he wondered how it was that Petrus de la Hospital, the president of Brittany, could have permitted that the ecclesiastics should be present at the accusation of such crimes against him, stating that he was a Christian and a Catholic, and that he was aware that such crimes would have been against faith. Then he was formally excommunicated, and it was decided to proceed with the trial, paying no attention to his declaration that he had appealed, since such appellation was merely in verbal declaration and not in writing, and since the enormity of the crimes of which he was accused demanded immediate attention. No progress was made during the day, and the court was adjourned until the morrow, when the information would be completed and formally lodged against the accused. The criminal proceedings in France, while different from those under the common law, yet still have some analogy therewith. There was no grand jury, but in its stead is an officer now called juge d'instruction. In this court, no such special officer seems to have existed, but the duty of the examining of witnesses, as done by the grand jury in the United States, was performed by the court itself, aided by the prosecutor. Instead of an indictment charging the crime as under the common law, an information is filed. The information is signed and presented in court by the prosecutor. While being prepared is entirely within his control. He has, under the law, the power of our grand jury of charging or refusing to charge crimes. Therefore, the indictment is his. This information, instead of simply charging the crime directly and in legal language, sets forth the history of the case, the jurisdiction of the court, and the attending circumstances of the crime charged, and ends with the usual prayers for conviction and punishment. The information against Gilles de Rais contained 49 articles and charged him with 3 distinct crimes. 1. The crimes of abduction, violation, and murder of the infants named. 2. The crimes of magic and sorcery. 3. Sacrilege in having violated the ecclesiastic immunity of the chapel of Saint Etienne de Mermort. The information was divided into 3 parts. The first 14 of the 49 articles were occupied with stating the jurisdiction of the court, that is to say, that Jean Malstreux was the Bishop of Nantes, that he was properly and legally appointed as such, that he was under his superior, the Archbishop, whose ecclesiastical province or cathedral was located at Tours. Then followed the power, authority, and right to sit of Jean Blum, the Vice-Inquisitor. Then the declaration of the nativity of Gilles de Rais, his residence in the diocese of, and duty owed to, the Bishop of Nantes. A declaration of the ecclesiastical authority of the bishop within his diocese over the chateau of Machacu and the chapel of Saint Etienne de Mermort, and, in fine, a complete statement with all necessary authority over the accused, and this part finished with the declaration that all things herein set forth were true, notorious, manifest, and within the knowledge of all and every person. The second part of the information comprised Articles 15 to 41. Article 15 was a general statement of all the crimes charged against Gilles and his accomplices. The names of the accused were first stated: Gilles de Retz, Gilles de Sille, Roger de Briqueville, Henriette Griart, Etienne Corriaud, alias Poitou, Andrea Bouchet, Jean Rossignol, Robin Romulart, called Spadine, Huguette de Bremont, and the crimes charged were the murder of infants, killed, dismembered, burned, treated in an inhuman manner. Then there were the immolation damnable of the bodies of these infants offered to the demon as a sacrifice, consultation with the demon, odious conduct, frightful abomination, brutal debauches, and taken together a catalogue of crimes, a luxury of offenses that exhausted the prosecutor to qualify in proper terms, and which, before a mixed assembly, could only be pronounced decently in Latin and not in vulgar language. He told of the excitement, dread, fear of the public clamor that had sprung up from one end of the country to the other, how it at last settled around the chateau of Machacoul, and that every time an abduction took place, some of the accomplices of Gilles had been discovered in the neighborhood. In making this part of his accusation, the prosecutor became filled with emotion, excited in his address and eloquent in his words. He described the conduct and feelings of the people, especially of the stricken parents, of their cries, loud lamentations, immense sorrow, the accusing insinuations of the people. He showed the innumerable persons of both sexes and all conditions, both in the cities and in the diocese of Nantes, who, bowed down by the weight of their grief and fright, had appealed to justice and to heaven with howls and cries, and had presented their complaints together before the seat of justice, their visages bathed in tears, for the loss of their sons and daughters, bringing to the bishop, the commissioners, and the prosecutors the authority of their tears and their griefs in support of the accusation. Article 16 commenced with the charge of the crime of conjuration and invocation of demons. Over this the prosecutor also became eloquent. His accusation was of an infraction of ecclesiastical law, and he dealt largely with the law of the Church. His charges abounded in quotations from the Bible, the 4th and 39th Psalms, adjurations from holy men, and was filled with many brave and eloquent words in description and denunciation of the abominable crime of black magic, conjuration, and sorcery. He takes up the Italian priests from their respective places in their native country and brings them along until they are joined to Gilles in Brittany. In the articles alleging crimes against infants, in Article 27 the accusation says, and the number of victims is upward of 140, possibly more. The articles of the accusation following set forth details of all these horrors, the action, conduct, and aid of the familiars of Gilles and his accomplices, when, where, for whom, and by whom the infants were taken, and their respective fates. These were all set forth in great detail and with great particularity, and Article 41 closes with the words, quote, "These are the crimes which make Gilles de Rais infamous, a heretic, an apostate, an idolate, and a relapse." Articles 42 to 47 were occupied with a recapitulation of the crimes committed by Gilles and his accomplices, and in Article 49 he concludes with the assurance that by such crimes and by such offenses the accused had incurred the sentence of excommunication and all other pains which follow the punishment to be assessed against such culpable of being the doers of evil deeds, the conjurers of evil spirits, their aiders and abettors, their friends, dependents, and finally all of those who have delivered themselves over to magic and the prohibited art. That the accused had fallen into heresy, that they were guilty of relapse, that they had offended the majesty of God, which was indefinitely worse than the offense against the priests. They had incurred, consequently, the penalties for crimes against his majesty divine. They had broken the commands of the Decalogue, the laws of the church, and had sown among the faithful Christians the most dangerous errors. Finally, that they were rendered culpable of crimes as enormous as they were hideous, all of which were in the jurisdiction of Bishop of Nantes. And in the closing sentences, the prosecutor demands that he shall be admitted now to make proof of what he has advanced. And this he will do, and so he promises, without further superfluity, reserving only the right to add, to correct, to change, to diminish, to interpret, and to put in order, produce any matters if they shall be necessary at the time and place convenient. And he demands the application of the punishment due for this crime. The prosecutor admitted that certain of the crimes set forth in the information were not within the jurisdiction of the ecclesiastical court, and they would have to be remitted to the secular court if punishment was expected. Gilles de Rais interrupted the reading of the information many times, making denials in favor of himself, blaming his judges, and denouncing the prosecutors. Everybody seems to have preserved his temper except Gilles, and at the close of the reading of the information, the judges turned to him and demanded his formal plea to the various accusations against him. Gilles remained obstinate and refused to plead, and demanded an appeal to the higher court. His conduct during the reading was such as to destroy any sympathy the judges may have had. Bishops and judges are but men, and it was too much to expect that the human side of the court would hear unmoved this abuse and contumely heaped upon it. Gilles' continued refusal to plead gave the prosecutor and court an opportunity to exercise their legal power, and the prosecutor demanded a decree of excommunication against Gilles for his contempt in this behalf committed. This was an interlocutory order, intended to correct the faults of Gilles during the trial. It was useless to imprison him, for he was already a prisoner. It was useless to threaten him with any other pains or penalties applied to his physical body. Therefore the court, using the only other power it had as an ecclesiastical body, issued its decree of excommunication, the only thunder it could fulminate against him. It is a curious commentary upon human nature, and throws a sidelight not simply upon the ecclesiastical courts, but also upon the human nature of that day, that Gilles, who had committed all the crimes in the calendar, and deserved death 1,000 times if he had had that many lives, who seemed to have no fear of any punishment inflicting physical pain or discomfort in this world, yet was so filled with dread of punishment in the next world, arising from the decree of excommunication which he believed and feared would deprive him of the solace of his religion and the benefit of the vicarious intercession of his Holy Mother Church, that, as we shall see, it produced the greatest effect upon him and was of the greatest efficacy in changing his course. The decree of excommunication having been passed upon Gilles de Rais, a postponement was ordered until Saturday following, October 15th. At the next sitting, Gilles had 2 or 3 days in which to think over his condition. Brought to the bar, the court put to him the original question: "How do you recognize us as your legitimate judges?" To which question, to the surprise of everyone who heard him, Gilles, who had heretofore been so proud and disdainful in all his refusals to respond affirmatively to this question, spoke out, quote, "Yes, I recognize the court as at present constituted. I have committed crimes, and they have been within the limits of this diocese," unquote. With words of humility and regret, his voice broken with emotion, with tears in his eyes, he demanded pardon of the bishop and vice-inquisitor for the words he had spoken so harshly against them. The bishop, who had heretofore been dignified, reserved, severe, as became a judge in the trial of a case, on hearing these words of submission and request for pardon, turned the other side of his character toward the repentant. He then became the priest whose duty was to pardon, comfort, and console erring and sinful men. But when Gilles prayed that his decree of excommunication be revoked, that he should be readmitted to the fold of the church and again be given the comforts of his religion, the bishop granted the prayers and received him again into the church, giving him words of comfort and good cheer. When this scene was finished, the prosecutor asked for the progress of the trial in the usual way. Gilles raised no objection, and expressed his willingness to enter his plea and take oath to speak the truth in all things whereof he was accused. The information was read to him at length in the Latin language, and explained section by section in the common French. Gilles responded to the first 14 articles, admitting in succession the powers of the bishop and of the vice-inquisitor, the lawful constitution of the court, and that he was a member of the church, and that the venue, as laid, was within the jurisdiction. Being further interrogated, he, however, denied all dealings with the evil one, all performances of magic, all attempts at sorcery, or that he had ever, either by himself or by another, sought to have communication with the evil one, or to invoke his power in any way in order to obtain riches, power, or long life. He admitted that he had once possessed a book that treated of alchemy and of the invocation of demons, that he had obtained it from a soldier who had been thrown in prison in Angers, and that he had talked with the soldier upon that subject, but had done nothing more. He had returned the book. The record recounts how, at this period in the trial, the prosecutor demanded of Gilles that they two, in order to be on equal terms, should take an oath to speak the truth. They advanced together, the prosecutor and the defendant, and putting their left hands between the hands of the bishop and the vice-inquisitor, their right hands bearing upon the holy evangel, they took together the oath, quote, to speak the truth and nothing but the truth, as to the matter before the court. The ceremony over, the formal plea of not guilty was entered by Gilles. Then came the introduction of witnesses, who were Henri Griard, Etienne Corriaud, alias Poitou, Francois Prelati, de Monte Cativo, Eustache Blanchet, Etienne of Saint-Malo, Stephanie Etiennette, widow of Robert Blanchet, and Perrine Martin, surnamed La Meffray. They were all brought to the bar by Robert Guillaume, the bailiff, and appeared on the side of the prosecutor and against the defendant. The oath which the witnesses took is given in substance in the record. They were sworn between the hands of the bishop and vice-inquisitor, as Gilles and the prosecutor had been, and their oath was that neither favor nor resentment, nor fear nor hate, nor friendship nor relationship should have any part of their words, and they put aside every spirit of party and of all personal affection, having regard only for truth and justice. The judges announced to Gilles the privileges of cross-examination, putting the questions himself if he desired to do so, for, be it understood, usually in criminal trials under the civil law, especially in France, the questions, whether they be by the prosecutor or by the accused, have to be handed up and are put by the presiding justice. But as it is usual for the witnesses to proceed and tell their story without interrogation, Gilles declared his willingness to have the regular course pursued, and that he would leave the matter to the conscience of the court. This being done, the witnesses were removed. For, be it understood, by no court practice in France are the witnesses who have not testified permitted to remain while others are giving testimony. The presence of Gilles' accomplices as witnesses against him must have given him an awful shock. As soon as the witnesses had left the courtroom, it seems that the condition of affairs presented themselves to Gilles in their true light, and showed him his serious and compromising situation. He was moved to great emotion, whether of remorse or fear cannot now be said. He demanded in supplicating tones that the revocation of the decree of excommunication should be in writing, not simply by oral decree. It would appear from such of the history of this great criminal as we have, that the only thing which produced any emotion in him and caused him to exhibit fear or dread of his position was this decree of excommunication. The bishop was in his forgiving mood. He had resumed his role of priest, and very properly he consented to do in writing which he had already done verbally, and the decree of excommunication was revoked. The court adjourned until the Monday thereafter, the 17th of October, when it was expected that the introduction of evidence would begin. The examination was taken either orally before the court or by the clerks who acted as examiners or notaries, and reduced the testimony to writing, reporting it or its substance to the court. D. Alneto Parvi Les were greffiers or clerks, and took most of the testimony for the ecclesiastical court, while Toucheronde did the same for the civil court, and it was reported under their respective certificates. October 17th was occupied with witnesses proving the crime of sacrilege committed on the chapel of Saint-Étienne de Mermort. On the 19th, the witnesses were examined touching the crime of abduction of infants. This interests us more than the other, and therefore we follow it with the names of the witnesses. Professor Jean de Pencourtic, Jean de Lanreche, André Seguin, Pierre Vimain, Jean Orients, Jean Brent, Jean Leville, Jean Picard, Guillaume Michel, Pierre Duret, Eutrope Chardavoine, Robert Guillaume, the doctor, Robin Roux, Jacques Tennessee. All of these were sworn, as before, to tell the truth without consideration of prayers or recompense, or fear or favor or hate or resentment or friendship or acquaintance's sake. Gilles again declined to cross-examine the witnesses. He declared his willingness to abide by their conscientious declarations. On October 20th, the court was convened for the purpose of hearing the depositions, and Gilles was asked with many questions what response he had to make. He continually said he had nothing to say, nothing to ask of the witnesses, and no witness of his own to introduce. Practically, he made no controversy over the testimony against him. The ecclesiastical court was equal to a court of the Inquisition. 200 or more years of practice by the Inquisition in prosecution of heresy had served to formulate rules of practice, and here is introduced one of the curiosities of human nature manifested in trials of justice when they are started in a given direction. Recurring to remarks concerning the legal necessity of obtaining a plea to the indictment or information, in order possibly to show the presence of the accused, and speculating upon that as the origin of the theory of the common law requiring the personal presence of the accused in order to give the court jurisdiction to try the case, and the proof of the corpus delicti in order to convict, it seems proper that a similar course of procedure and reasoning should prevail in cases of heresy, an offense which dealt so largely with matters of belief. Therefore, the ecclesiastical court or the inquisitor, whether established as a court or not, deemed it necessary to appeal to the inner consciousness and the private knowledge of the accused in regard to his belief, and to that end put questions that demanded an answer. As a matter of course, the prisoner, if a heretic, would refuse to answer because he could not convict himself, and hence grew up, this is only a suggestion of the author, a system which seems horrible and revolting to all lawyers, that is, the application of torture to compel the prisoner to make the necessary answer. No other punishment could be provided, for the accused was already a prisoner and being punished as such. As nothing in the way of legal punishment further than imprisonment would be visited upon him, the Inquisition fell upon torture as a means of extorting a confession, and thus it forced from the unwilling lips of the accused a declaration of his belief. This would soon extend to all his knowledge concerning the matters at issue, and when he should declare himself innocent, whatever true it might be, the torture could be applied again and again, harder and greater, until the power of resistance on the part of the accused was overcome, and he would give up because of his inability to resist further. So it appeared in the case of Gilles. The witnesses had testified to everything necessary to be proved. Gilles had admitted the jurisdiction and the corpus delicti, and had practically admitted his immediate and direct connivance and assistance in the various abductions, as well as the sacrilege. Still, on his refusal to proceed further, the prosecutor demanded the application of torture. It was, according to our ideas, a lamentable condition of the course of justice, when the application of the torture should have been so common a proceeding that, on demand of the prosecutor, it would be allowed by the court, even when the guilt of the prisoner was beyond dispute. This seems to have been the course of the court in the case of Gilles, and the petition for torture, as made by the prosecutor, was allowed by the court, and the next day set for its application. It was said that the instrument of torture was already put in place, and for the convenience of all parties, the prosecutor had chosen the hall adjoining that occupied by Gilles, to the end that the torture should be applied with as little trouble as possible, and whatever might be the result of it, that Gilles should be properly attended to in case of need. On this demand, the prosecutor for torture and its allowance by the judges, Gilles' courage left him. He became frightened, turned pale, and trembled. So full of fear and terror was he that scarcely he was able to speak intelligently. He threw himself at the feet of his judges, and in broken accents with cries and sobs, besought and supplicated them not to put him to this test, making all kinds of promises as to what he would do in order to escape torture. He prayed for leave to make confession of his crimes, and to have the Bishop of Saint-Brieuc assigned for that purpose. It was agreed that the judge, Pierre L'Hospital, the president of Brittany, should sit with the bishop to hear the proposed confession, but that the session should be held at 2 o'clock that afternoon. Gilles agreed to this, as he would have agreed to anything else, and he promised to make a clean breast of the whole affair. But as an evidence of the terror with which he contemplated the torture, he demanded that his examination and confession should be taken in a hall as distant as possible from that of the torture. The court agreed to this proposition at once, and the 2 officials named were assigned the duty. The secretaries or clerks of the court, acting respectively for those high functionaries, were Jean Parvy for the ecclesiastical court and Jean de Toucheron for the civil court. It is said that Gilles' confession before these 2 representatives of the ecclesiastical and civil powers was made in public, where everybody who desired could enter and hear. This confession of the same day is headed in the records for what is extrajudicial, for what reason is unknown. But as there was a fuller and apparently a judicial confession made by him the next day, which will be given at length, the confession extrajudicial, the incident only being mentioned. The president of Brittany, Pierre L'Hospital, undertook the interrogation of Gilles. He took up first the crimes against the infants, their abduction and murder, and went through that with great minutiae, pushing it to all details. Then the same with regard to sorcery and the invocation of demons, the bloody sacrifices that had been offered to the evil one, as had been in evidence so many days. Pressed to tell where this commenced, Gilles said it was at the Chateau of Champotis, that the time was so long ago that he had forgotten and was unable to identify it, except that it was in the year in which his grandfather, Jean de Craon, had died. Quote, "Who gave to you, and how did you get the idea of committing these crimes?" Response, "No one. My own imagination drove me to do so. The thought was my own, and I have nothing to which to attribute it except my own desire for the knowledge of evil." Unquote. It appears from the report of the case that the president of Brittany did not believe these statements of Gilles to be possible. He was so much astonished to hear this declaration that he pushed the examination with great detail, insisted upon fuller and more specific answers. He approached Gilles sometimes from the legal side, sometimes from the ecclesiastical. Sometimes he threatened him with the punishment of the secular arm. At other times he pleaded with him and held out the offers of pardon from the Lord Jesus Christ. And by virtue of all these, he besought Gilles to go back over the words which he had spoken, to make a truthful and honest avowal of the causes which led him to the commission of these frightful crimes. There were 3 languages employed in these proceedings. Probably all 3 were spoken by the higher orders. The Latin by the ecclesiastical authorities, and that language was employed by the ecclesiastical court. Then the French language, which was foreign to Brittany, but which probably Gilles and all those concerned in the trial understood, while as for the common people, doubtless their knowledge was confined to the Breton language. The confession of Gilles, reduced to writing by the clerk's secretary, not verbatim, nor pretending to be so, but to have written out only in substance, as is done in the case of testimony before an examiner or notary who employs longhand. While the president was pushing this investigation and cross-examination so far, to the visible annoyance and great trouble of Gilles, he cried out in French, quote, "Alas, Monseigneur, you torment yourself and me also, both of us, unnecessarily." "No," replied the president of Brittany, "I do not torment myself, but I am astonished at what you have said, and I am scarcely content with it. My only desire is to have you tell the truth concerning the causes which I have so oftentimes asked you." Responded Gilles, "There is no other cause. I have told you the truth in everything that has happened. I have said to you all things as they are, and enough to kill 10,000 men." Then the president gave over interrogating him and accepted his declaration as true. He was sent back to his chamber, and his accomplice, Francois Prelati, the Italian priest, chemist, and alchemist, was also brought out. Prelati had already confessed to the invocation of evil spirits, and that he had made offerings of the blood and of the members of an infant. Being interrogated, he made his formal confession, and also reduced to writing, but it turned out that this was only a repetition of an informal confession. So excited, no great response. The interrogator seemed more interested in the invocation of demons than in the abduction and murder of the infants. Gilles and Francois were brought together before the judges and the bishop, and upon the conclusion of the séance, they were sent back to their respective prisons. On parting, Gilles turned toward Francois, and sobbing, embraced him with sorrow, and addressed to him his last words. Quote, "Adieu, my Francois, my friend. Never again will we see each other in this world. I pray that you may have good patience and hope in God, and that we will see each other in the great joy of paradise. Pray to God for me, and I will pray for you." Unquote. They tenderly embraced each other, then separated, never to see each other again. This scene happened, and these two confessions were made before the two officers in private audience, in chambers as it were. The next day, on Saturday, October 22nd, the judicial confession of Gilles was made and presented before the court. It is given herewith. The confession of Gilles de Rais. On Saturday, the 22nd of the aforesaid month of October, the aforesaid master, Guillermo Champignon, promoter, prosecutor on the one hand, of the aforesaid Gilles de Rais, defendant, on the other, personally repaired to the trial before the before-mentioned lords, the Reverend Father, the Lord Bishop of Nantes, the brother John Blune, vicar of the said inquisitor, who had taken their seats in the tribunal there, in the aforesaid place at the vesper hour for the rendition of justice. In acting in accordance with the assignment of the day of trial on the motion of the said prosecutor, the aforementioned lords, the Bishop of Nantes, and brother John Blune, vicar of the aforesaid inquisitor, asked the aforesaid Gilles, the defendant, whether he wished to say anything or make any opposition or objection to the evidence or charges produced or maintained in this case and similar cases. The defendant, indeed, said and replied that he did not wish to say anything, and fully and of his own accord, and with great compunction and bitterness of heart, as was evident at first sight, and with copious shedding of tears, confessed that the already recorded charges elsewhere, extrajudicially confessed to in his room in presence of the aforesaid Reverend Father, the Lord Bishop of Saint-Brouec, of Master Pierre de la Hospital, the President, of Jean de Toucheronde, and of Jean Parvy, as well as all and everything contained and described in the articles inserted above, will be and are true. In adding to his extrajudicial confession already inserted and not receding from it, which the same accused wished right here to be considered as repeated and declared, and as he stated, rectifying the defects if perchance he had omitted anything in it, and moreover more fully declaring and enlarging, he freely confessed some things contained in the summary form in certain of the aforementioned articles, and said, to wit, that he had committed and perpetrated very many other greater and more enormous crimes and sins against God and his commandments than are contained in the articles already inserted, from the beginning of his iniquitous youth against God and his writings, and that he had offended our Savior himself by the evil training he had had in his boyhood, in which he had endeavored to perform whatever pleased him with unbridled rein, and had given himself to everything illicit, and imploring those present who had children, that they have their sons brought up and trained in their youth and boyhood in religious instruction and virtue. After this confession, it is already stated, judicially given and made by the aforesaid Gilles de Rais, the accused, of the contents of the aforesaid articles, and after the extrajudicial confession repeated and declared, the same accused moreover made another confession in the following tenor, separate and apart, in the presence of the Reverend Father in Christ, Lord John Prugency, Bishop of Saint-Brouec, and the nobleman Pierre de Hospital, and of John Abatis and John Toucheronde, concerning the aforementioned perpetrations, crimes, and sins, embracing the vices and sins mentioned, all iniquitously committed by him, not only as much as is perhaps contained in the aforewritten articles, already freely confessed to by Gilles himself, the accused, and in order that said secret confession be more widely published, the same Gilles, defendant, thought it proper that, without departing from the said extra judicial confession made by him concerning the said charges, but rather to strengthen and corroborate it, the confession itself be published in the vernacular for the benefit of the people, and all then and there assisting, by whom the greater part shall knew no Latin. And that, however, the introductory remark be added informing those present that the culprit submitted to this general revelation of his guilt, in order by the shame this publication and confession of such crimes committed by him would cause him the more easily to obtain from God pardon and remission for his sins, and to have wiped away the transgression committed by him. He wished the public to know that during his youth he had always been tenderly reared, had committed as much as in him lay, and with nothing to check his inclination, all the evil deeds he could, had centered all his hope, intention, and work upon the commission of illicit and shameful deeds, and had employed his hope, intention, and work in unlawful acts by perpetrating said crimes, most earnestly beseeching and exhorting the fathers, mothers, friends, and relatives of all youths to guide their charges along the paths of honesty, by setting them a good example and instilling into them sound doctrine, and to chastise every fault against good morals, to save them from the snares into which he himself had fallen. By this secret confession, which was examined and publicly read in court in the presence of the said Gilles, defendant, and approved by Gilles himself, the defendant, the said Gilles de Rais, the defendant, manifested his own accord before all present, and confessed that he, led by passion and the delight he took in satisfying his carnal appetite, of which mention will be made later on, had stolen or had caused to be stolen very many boys, the number he could not remember, that he had put these boys to death and caused them to be killed, and that with them he had committed crimes and sins, that he had killed these boys sometimes himself with his own hand, and sometimes through the agency of others, especially the above-mentioned Gilles de Rais, Lord Roger Brickville, soldier, Henri Poitou, Rossignol, and Little Robin, by various kinds and modes of torture, some by the amputation and separation of their heads from their bodies, using daggers or poniards and knives, some others, however, with sticks or other implements for striking by beating them on the head with violent blows, others again by tying them with cords and fastening them to some door or iron hook in his own room, that they might be strangled and languish. He continued that with these boys, even whilst languishing, and after their death, he took delight in kissing and gazing intently at those who had the more beautifully formed heads, and in cruelly opening and causing to be opened their bodies, that he might see their interior, and that frequently, whilst these boys were dying, he would sit on their stomachs and take great pleasure in seeing them thus dying, and that he used to laugh heartily at the sight with the said Corillod and Henriet. The corpses he caused afterwards to be burned and reduced to ashes by the same Corillod and Henriet and others. Interrogated concerning the places where he had perpetrated the aforementioned crimes, and at what time he had begun to do those things, and concerning the number of those killed after this manner, he answered and said that in the Chateau de Champotes, from that year on which he lived, the Lord de la Suze, the maternal uncle of said defendant, that in this place he had killed and caused to be killed very many boys, the number he could not remember, the aforesaid Gilles de Rais, alone knowing of the matter of the time, that afterwards the aforesaid Roger de Brickville, then Henriet, Stephen Corillod, Rossignol, and Robin became successively his accomplices and sharers in these crimes. He said that bones, both of the heads and the bodies of the boys killed in the aforementioned Chateau de Champotes, as has been stated, which had been thrown into the lower apartment of a certain tower of that castle, he himself produced from that spot, placed in coffins or chests, and transported by water to the place and castle of Machicule aforesaid, burned there and caused there to be reduced to ashes. And also in that same place he himself, defendant, seized, killed, and caused to be stolen and killed many other boys in large numbers, how many he could not recollect. And that again, in the manor called La Suze of Nantes, which he, Gilles, defendant, then owned, he had similarly killed and caused to be killed, burned, reduced to ashes, many other boys of whom he could not remember the numbers. The same Gilles de Rais, defendant, narrated and confessed that all misdeeds, crimes, transgressions above mentioned he committed and criminally perpetrated of his own free will and accord alone, for the purpose of satisfying his evil, iniquitous complacency and pleasure, and not out of any other motive or intention, with no one to urge or advise him, defendant, or even call his attention to such thoughts. Furthermore, he declared and confessed that, after the expiration of a year and a half, the Lord Eustace Blanchet aforesaid summoned the aforesaid Francois Prelati from the country of Florence in Lombardy, and invited him to the same Gilles, defendant, for the purpose of invoking demons according to the intention of the defendant, and that Francois, summoned to the same person, informed him that he, Francois, had discovered in the country whence he had come means of conjuring up a certain spirit by the aid of incantations, which spirit had promised him, Francois, that he would cause a certain demon called Baron to come to him, as often as the same Francois might desire. Likewise, the same Gilles de Rais declared and confessed that the same Francois made several invocations of demons in compliance with a command of himself, both during his absence and sometimes when he was present, and that he was in person present at 3 such invocations of Francois who made them, one in the Chateau Tafage, another in Bourgneuf de Retz, and that concerning the third aforesaid invocation he did not recall in which place it was made. And he added that the said Lord Eustace knew that the said Francois was making such invocations, but that the same Lord Eustace was not present at these invocations, since neither the defendant himself nor Francois would permit him to be present, as the same Lord Eustace, in an indirect, evil, and restless tongue. Besides, the self-same defendant declared and confessed that during these invocations there were traced as characters on the ground figures of a circle and a cross, and that the same Francois possessed a book which he had carried about his person, which contained many names of demons and formulae for their making of such conjurations, and the invocations of demons, which names and formula he could not remember, that the said Francois held and read this book for about 2 hours, during and for each invocation, but that none of his own conjurations or invocations the defendant saw or noticed any devil, and that none spoke to him, at which he was much displeased and vexed. Afterwards, the same defendant declared and confessed that after a certain invocation made by the said Francois, during the absence of the said defendant, the same Francois, on his return from that very invocation, informed the said defendant that he had seen and addressed the said Baron, who told him that Baron did not appear to the said defendant because the defendant had deceived Baron regarding some promises read by the said defendant to Baron, because he had not fulfilled his promise. Hearing this, he said, Francois asked the same devil, what he wished to receive from the said defendant, and that whatever the same Baron might wish to receive and ask of the defendant, he would give him, except his soul and life, provided the devil would give and grant him whatever he would ask. The defendant added that it had been and was his intention to ask and acquire from the same devil knowledge, riches, and power, by the possession and aid of which he, defendant, would be enabled to return to his former state of dominion and power, and that afterward the same Francois told the said defendant that he had conversed with the devil, and that the said devil, among other things, required and wished that the defendant present to him limb or limbs of some infant, that the defendant later delivered to the said Francois the hand, heart, and eyes of an infant to be offered and given to the same devil on the part of the said defendant. Again, the said Gilles de Rais, defendant, declared and confessed that before he took part in the second of the 3 aforesaid invocations, at which he insisted in person as stated above, he wrote and signed with his own hand a grant, to the bottom of which he appended his name in the vernacular, Videlicet Gilles, the contents of which, however, he does not remember, which grant he composed and signed with the intention of handing it over to the devil, if he had come while he came conjured or summoned by the said Francois. And this he did, acting upon the advice of Francois, who previously had told the defendant that he must hand over that grant to the devil as soon as the spirit should come or approach, and that during this invocation the defendant continually held that grant in his hand, waiting to hear the promise and agreement concerning which Francois and the devil should come to terms regarding the matters which the said defendant was to promise and do for the devil, who did not appear or speak to them, so that accordingly the defendant did not ever hand over the mentioned grant. Again, said defendant declared and confessed that he himself sent the aforesaid Stephen Corillard, alias Poitou, along with the said Francois, as Francois was one night going out to make one of the aforesaid invocations. These two, on their return, drenched by a heavy rainstorm, stated to the defendant that during the invocation nothing had come to them. Again, the said defendant declared and confessed that wishing to assist at a certain invocation which Francois proposed to make, the latter expressed his dissatisfaction that Gilles should then be present at the invocation. Returning from the invocation, he said that the defendant, if he had been present at the invocation, he would have run great risk, for at that invocation there came and appeared a serpent to the same Francois, which filled him with great fear. Hearing this, the defendant, after taking and causing to be carried near him a particle of the true cross in his possession, expressed a longing to go to the spot of the said invocation where said Francois claimed to have seen the reptile. This, however, did not in deference to Francois's prohibition. Again, the same Gilles de Rais, defendant, declared and confessed that at one of the 3 aforesaid invocations at which he assisted, as is stated above, he said Francois informed him that he had seen in the said baron, who showed him a large quantity of gold, among other things, an ingot of gold, but the said defendant said he had seen neither the devil nor the said ingot, but only a sort of gold leaf, under the form of a leaf of gold, which he did not touch. Again, the said defendant declared and confessed subsequently that when he was recently at the court of the most illustrious lord and prince, the lord of Brittany, in the canton Josselin of the diocese Maclovia, he caused to be killed several boys furnished him by the aforesaid Henriette, in the above stated manner. Again, the same defendant declared and confessed that the said Francois, acting on the instigation and during the absence of the defendant, performed there at Jocelyn an invocation of the demons, at which he learned that nothing took place. Again, the said defendant, setting out from Bitterus, dismissed the said Francois at the same Chateau de Taffage, asking him meanwhile, and during the absence of the said defendant, to attend and devote himself diligently to such incantations, and to repeat to the defendant whatsoever he would learn, do, and think in that regard, and that Francois wrote to him, the absent defendant, and has been stated in cipher, called in French par paroles couvertes, that his transactions went on satisfactorily, and that at this time the same Francois sent him, the defendant, a certain object after the manner of an ointment lodged in a silver capsule and purse, also made of silver, and said Francois, writing at the same time to the aforesaid defendant, that this was an entirely precious object, and advising the said defendant furthermore in his letter to guard the object solicitously. The defendant, giving credence to this admonition of the said Francois, hung the object with the above-mentioned purse about his neck and wore it for several days thus suspended. Afterwards, however, the defendant removed the object from his neck and threw it away, as he discovered that it would not in the least benefit him. Again, the same defendant declared and confessed that the said Francois once told him that the aforesaid baron bade the defendant feed, in the name of the said baron, 3 poor men on 3 great feasts, which the defendant did on a certain All Saints' Day, and only once. Interrogated why he thus kept his house and about his person the aforementioned Francois, he made answer that Francois was clever, valuable to him, and pleasant company because he spoke Latin beautifully and charmingly, and because, furthermore, he showed himself anxious concerning the proper administration of his affairs. Again, the said defendant declared and confessed that after the last festival of St. John the Baptist, a certain handsome youth who stayed with a man named Rodriguez, dwelling in the aforesaid place Bourgneuf de Retz, was one night brought to him, defendant, as he dwelt in the same place, by the said Henriette and Stephen Corriad, alias Poitou, and that during that night the defendant caused him to be killed and to be burned near Machecoul. Again, the said defendant declared and confessed that news having reached him that the soldiers of the municipal fortress of Palau strove to put to death the captain of the fortress, Saint Stephen de Mala, when indignant at this, he, defendant, set out with his men and rode on a certain day, which he did not remember, from daybreak, intending to attack the soldiery of the fortress of Palau, seize them and punish them if he could meet them. The said Francois, who rode among the others in the retinue of the said defendant, foretold from the start of this expedition that the defendant would not find on that day the said soldiery of the fortress of Palau, and in fact he did not meet them, so that the intention of the defendant was frustrated. Again, the same Gilles de Rais declared and confessed that he had detained in his power and caused to be killed 2 apprentices, one of Guillaumin Sanzé and another of Petri Jacquet, named Prince or Prince. Again, the said defendant declared and confessed in court that at the time of his last stay at Vienne, in the month of July, Andrew Bouchet handed over and delivered up to the said Gilles, defendant, in the dwelling house of a certain John Lemoyne, at which the said Gilles defendant was at that time enjoying hospitality a certain boy, that he himself afterwards caused this said Poitou to throw the killed lad into the privy of a residence belonging to a certain Baudin, close by the residence of the said Lemoyne, in which residence or house of Baudin the horses of said defendant had been sheltered, near the marketplace of said Vienne, and that Poitou for this purpose flooded the privy so as to submerge and cover the corpse of said boy, lest it be discovered. Again, the said Gilles similarly declared and confessed that before the arrival of the aforesaid Francois, he had other conjurers of demons, that is to say, a certain trumpeter called de Menil, Master John Riparia, a certain Louis, Master Anthony de Palermo, and another whose name he could not remember, that these conjurers, at the instigation of said Gilles, defendant, made several incantations of spirits, at some of which the said Gilles, defendant, was present in person, both near the aforesaid Chateau de Machecoul or elsewhere, principally to see the circle or outline or sign of a circle drawn on the ground prior to the incantation, with the intention of seeing the devil, of speaking with him, and making bargains with him. But the same defendant declared that he could never see nor converse with the said devil, though for this purpose he had taken all the pains he could, so that indeed it was not the fault of the said defendant that he did not see the devil nor converse with him. Again, the frequently mentioned Gilles declared and confessed that the aforesaid Menil, a wizard, informed the defendant that once the devil, in order to do and fulfill the things which he had said defendant had intended to ask and obtain from the said devil, desired to receive from the said defendant a grant, written, made by him, defendant, with his own hand, and signed with the blood of one of his fingers, in which grant the aforesaid defendant should promise to give to the said devil, whenever he appeared during the invocation of the said defendant, certain things which he, defendant, could not remember, and that the same defendant, for this purpose and end, signed the said grant with his own hand, with blood drawn from his little finger, and subjoined his own name to the said grant. That he could not accurately remember the other statements contained in this grant, except that he promised by the honor of said grant to deliver up to said devil the articles mentioned in the grant, provided that the devil would give or grant the same Gilles knowledge, power, and riches. But the defendant is quite certain, as he says, that whatsoever he may have promised the devil by this or other grants, he always and decidedly made exception of and reserved his soul and his life. And he says that this grant was not handed to the devil at this time, since he did not appear to the said Gilles, defendant, at or during this incantation. Furthermore, the said defendant likewise declared and confessed that once the said master John Riparia made one of his invocations in a wood or grove situated near the Chateau de Pouzage, and that this Riparia, after going to make this invocation, armed himself with weapons and implements of protection to his body, and thus armed he approached the said grove, intending to make the invocation, and that when the said defendant, accompanied by his servants, and especially by Eustace, Henriette, and Stephen Corriod, alias Poitou, started after a little while towards the said grove, and met the said de Riparia returning from that grove. Then said de Riparia and the Gilles that he had seen the devil coming to him in the guise of a leopard that passed in front of him, and told something to him, de Riparia, which infused great fear into the said de Riparia. And the defendant added in his narration that the said Riparia, to whom the defendant had given the sum of 20 louis d'or, took his departure after this invocation, promising to return later, which he did not do. Similarly, the same accused said and confessed that when another invocation of the demons, which the accused and a certain one of the above-mentioned invocators, whose name is not mentioned, who is an associate of Gilles de Rais, made in a certain room of the above-mentioned Chateau Teffage, de Rais himself did not attempt to enter the circle or circular sign made in the said room for the invocation. Nay, rather he withdrew to a window of that room with the intention of jumping out if he should feel anything terrible approach, there holding in his arms an image of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And the said accused, standing within the circular sign, feared very much, and especially as the said invocator forbade him to make the sign of the cross, as otherwise they, the accused and the invocator, would be in great danger. Nor did the accused for this reason attempt to make that sign, but then remembering a certain prayer of the Blessed Virgin Mary, which begins Alma, said invocator ordered the said accused to go out of the circle, and withdrawing quickly and going out of the room, the invocator being left remaining there, and the door of the room being closed by the above said invocator, he went up to the aforesaid Gilles de Rais, who forthwith said to the accused that the invocator thus left the room and was beaten and struck to such an extent as if the striking was done by kicking. And when the accused heard this, he opened the room right away, and in the entrance of the room, said accused saw said invocator on his face, grievously wounded and weakened in other parts of his body, among other strokes and blows then sustained by said invocator, in the forehead and otherwise wounded, so that the invocator could not support himself. Wherefore, said accused, fearing that the invocator by reason of that beating would die, wanted and made said invocator receive the sacrament of confession. He, however, did not die, but got well after that same trouncing. The said Gilles de Rais, accused, also said and confessed that he commissioned the aforesaid Gilles de Rais to go to the upper country to look for and bring to Gilles, accused, invocators of demons or malignant spirits. And that this Gilles de Rais, thus commissioned and having returned, related to the same Gilles de Retz how he had found a woman who occupied herself with such invocations, and that she had said to the same de Rais that unless Gilles de Retz would remove his heart from the church and his chapel, he could never fulfill his intention, and that the said de Rais found in those parts another woman who had said to the same that unless the said accused would desist and cease from a certain work on which he was intent and which he desired to follow out, he would never have a day's luck. Also said de Rais had found in these parts an invocator, of whom the said de Rais proposed and began, as he said, to conduct the said accused, but that on the way, the invocator being disposed to come to the said accused, as he was crossing a river or stream, accidentally fell in. Also said Gilles, accused, said and confessed that de Rais brought another invocator to said accused, and that he died without delay, in and from the obsequies of such unfortunate deceased and from other previous difficulties, which interfering he could not come to the aforesaid invocations and his other damnable intentions. He said that he believed the divine clemency and intercessory prayers of the church, from which his heart and hope never deviated, mercifully preserved him from perishing in such risks and dangers, and for this reason he proposed to desist from this bad life for the future, and to visit the holy places in Jerusalem, and to visit abroad the principal places of the life and passion of his Redeemer, and to perform other penances by which he might mercifully obtain from his Redeemer the pardon of his sins. Wherefore, after he had said and confessed freely and of his own accord the aforesaid things at the trial, as recorded, he exhorted the people there present, and especially the ecclesiastics who were present in the majority, that they always held in reverence and in the highest esteem Holy Mother Church, and never depart from it, especially adding that he, the accused, not directed and attached his heart and mind to the church. He could never have escaped the malice and schemes of the devil, nay, rather he believed that the devil would long since have strangled him and almost carried off his soul by reason of his enormous crimes and sins. And he, moreover, exhorted every head of a family to avoid permitting their children's being clothed in soft raiment and living in idleness, hinting and asserting that from idleness and excess at table many evils spring, more expressly declaring in his own case that idleness and the too frequent and too choice partaking of delicate meats and blood-stirring wines were the chief sources of having committed so many sins and crimes. For which sins and crimes committed by him, as stated, Gilles de Rais, accused, humbly and in tears, begging mercy and pardon of his Creator and most holy Redeemer, as well of the parents and friends of the aforesaid children cruelly murdered, and of all others whom he had sinned against or injured, both those there present or elsewhere, and the help of the devout prayers of all of Christ's faithful and Christ's worshippers, both present and absent. Wherefore the said Master, Guillermus Chapillon, promoter in case of said Gilles de Rais, accused, having the free confession of the matter and the other facts legitimately proved against same accused, immediately asked that a certain day and suitable closing day for trial for same Gilles de Rais be preferred and assigned to bringing to an end. And seeing its being brought to an end as well for judgment and definite sentence, they said, Reverend Father in Christ, Lord Bishop of Nantes, and Brother John Blune, Vicar of said Inquisition, and by every one of them, or those, by those assigned and deputed to this trial, and made in writing and promulgated at this trial and trials of this kind, or that said Gilles de Rais accused should state cause, if he had a reasonable one, why this should not be done. Whereupon the lords, the bishop, and the vicar of the aforesaid Inquisition said that Tuesday next was fixed, determined on, and assigned for the prosecutor and for Gilles de Rais accused, he not opposing it, to proceed to justice, as it might seem necessary in this and similar trials. Of the aforesaid things, the prosecutor asked that, one and several documents be made and drawn up for him by us, the subscribed notaries and scribes. There were present in aforesaid place Reverend Father in Christ, Lord Jean Pregency, Bishop of Sembrou, Master Pierre de la Hospital, President of Brittany, Robert de Riparia, and Lord Robert de Espinay, aforesaid soldier, and the nobleman Yvon de Rosurf, as well as the honorable men, masters Yvon Corer, John Salmonist, canons of the Church of the Blessed Mary of Nantes and St. Brou, Hervé Levy, Seneschal Corsopatensi, and Master Guillermo de la Horie, licentiate of laws, advocate of the secular court of Nantes, as well as several other witnesses gathered in that great crowd, being specially summoned and called for the aforesaid things. By this time all hope seemed to have departed from Gilles. He had none of the bravado that sustained him at the beginning of the trial. He apparently had recognized his condition and had thrown himself upon the mercy of God. One can easily understand how he was thus affected while under the influence of the saintly churchmen by whom he was surrounded, with their prayers and beseechings, that if his body was to be condemned for the deeds done, he should at least save his soul from the fires of hell. When Gilles was interrogated before the court as to the genuineness of this confession, and asked if he desired to make any retraction or explanation, he seemed to add to rather than detract from it, and believing, as was probably the truth, that he could only save his soul by making a surrender of all of his thoughts and a confession of all of his sins, he seemed to insist on having the record of his crimes made fuller and in greater detail, so that none of them, even with all their horror, should be omitted. It was during this session that he used the remarkable words partially quoted in the early part of this book. Quote, "If I have so much offended against God, I owe it, alas, to the evil direction that I received in my youth. I went at that time, the reins upon my neck, free to pursue all my pleasures, and did not restrain myself from anything evil." Unquote. And addressing himself to the parents in the crowd, he said, quote, "O you who have sons and daughters, I pray you to instruct them in good doctrine in their infancy and their youth, and lead them with care upon the paths of virtue." Unquote. The relief produced on his mind by his confession, casting off the great load he had been carrying, caused his spirits to rise to a contemplation of the situation, which produced a calm, if not a joy, in the assurance that he had made his peace with God and secured a place in paradise. Apparently stimulated by this feeling, he grew eloquent, and although some of the words may have been put into his mouth by those who reported him, yet one can see easily that he was filled with emotion and that the thoughts crowded thick upon them because of his belief that in this way his soul had escaped hellfire. Quote, "Judged by the declaration that I have made here, of the faults of which I am culpable, by the shame which appears in my face, I hope to obtain more easily the grace of God and the remission of my sins. I think they will be easier forgotten in his mercy. My entire youth was passed in the delicacies of the table. I was subject to my caprices. Nothing to me was sacred. All the evils that I could do have been accomplished. In this I put all my hope, all my thought, all my care. Everything that was prohibited, everything that was dishonest attracted me, and in order to obtain it, there was no means, however shameful and disgraceful, that I was not ready to employ." Unquote. Addressing himself this time to the public present, he said, quote, "Mothers and fathers who hear me, and you all, friends, relatives, and guardians of the young, whom you love, whoever you may be, I pray you be watchful over them. Form for them good manners, set for them a good example, teach them healthy doctrine, nourish them in your hearts, but above all, do not fear to correct their faults, for, as I myself have been, so it is possible for them to become, and so likewise they may fall into the same abyss." Unquote. As he sat down amidst the silence of that awful hour, a visible shudder ran over the audience. Judges and priests, accustomed one to condemn, the other to console, both hearing the terrible confessions of evil deeds, were visibly affected. Before any word or business could be spoken, Gilles arose again to say another word. Quote, "Whatever may be the perils of my soul, I am still not drowned or lost. I am redeemable, and I believe that the clemencies of God and the suffrages of the Holy Church, in which I have always put my hope and my heart, have succored me with such mercy. To all who hear me, clerks and priests of the Church, I would say, love always our Holy Mother Church. Revere her, give to her always the greatest respect. If I had not had this reverence and respect for her in my heart and in my affliction, I never would have been able to escape the hands of the demon. The nature of my crimes is such that without the protection of the church, the demon would have strangled me and carried me, soul and body, to the depths." Unquote. It is reported that, addressing for a third time the fathers of the families, he said, quote, "Guard you well, I pray you, to lift your infants above the delicacies of life and the fatal sweetness of idleness, for the excesses of appetite and the habits of idleness give rise to the greatest evils. Idleness, the delicacies of the table, the frequent use of wine, drinking, appetite, drunkenness, these things are the causes of my faults and my crimes. O God, my Creator, my well-beloved Redeemer, I ask mercy and pardon. And you, parents and friends of the infants that I have so cruelly put to death, you against whom I have sinned and whom I have so nearly destroyed, present or absent, in whatever place you may be, as Christians and faithfuls of Jesus Christ, I pray you on my knees and with tears to accord to me, to give to me, the succor and aid of your pious prayers." Unquote. The effect of these words can be better understood than described. Amid the impressive silence of such a spectacle, nothing was to be said. The court adjourned until the next day, Tuesday, October 25th, and the crowd poured silently and sorrowfully into the streets on their way to their homes, each heart filled with the most profound emotions, and each person cherishing the remembrance of the most solemn scene he had ever witnessed and the gravest advice he had ever heard. The session of the next day was to hear the sentence of the court. It had been reduced to writing, and was read by the clerk, Jacques Pentcoetic, an official of the Church of Nantes. Quote, "In the holy name of Christ, we, Jean Bishop of Nantes, and Brother Jean Blum, Bachelor of Holy Scripture, of the Order of Friars, Preachers, and Delegate for the Inquisitor, for heresy for the city and diocese of Nantes, in session as attributed, and having nothing before our eyes but God alone, the advice and consent of our Lord Bishop, jurisconsuls, the doctors, professors of Holy Scripture here present, after having examined all the depositions of the witnesses in charge called in our own name, and in the name of the prosecutor deputized by us, against Gilles de Rais, our subject, and under our jurisdiction, after having reduced to writing and digested the depositions, after having heard his own proper confession made spontaneously in our presence, and after having weighed and considered these and all other reasons which can affect our determination, we pronounce, we decide, we declare that thou, Gilles de Rais, cited before our tribunal, art shamefully culpable of heresy, apostasy, invocation of demons, and for these crimes thou hast incurred the sentence of excommunication and all the other punishments determined by right and by law. And finally, thou oughtest to be punished and corrected according to the will of the law and the exigencies of the holy canons, as a heretic, apostate, and invocator of demons." Unquote. The second sentence was in similar language, concluding, however, as follows. Quote, "Thou, Gilles de Rais, hast shamefully committed crimes with infants of one or the other sex. Thou hast committed sacrilege. Thou hast violated the immunities of the church. For by these crimes thou hast incurred the sentence of excommunication and all other punishments fixed by law. And thou art by consequence to be punished and corrected according to thy salvation and the will and exigencies of law and the holy canons." Unquote. All of Gilles' fears returned when he realized that he was to be convicted of heresy and condemned in excommunication. Falling to his knees, tears in his eyes, trembling, he humbly pleaded and begged the judges to lift from his life, now so near ended and so worthless, this excommunication. After consultation together, it was determined by the bishop and the vice-inquisitor to grant this prayer, and the decree of excommunication was annulled in the usual form. Gilles was admitted to the administration of the holy sacraments and permission given him to commune with the faithful. Gilles immediately demanded the appointment of a priest to hear him in confession, that he might profess his penitence and receive absolution from his sins. And the Frère Jean Juvenal, a Carmelite of Ploux-Armel, was designated for that purpose. So terminated the ecclesiastical trial of Gilles de Rais. It commenced on the 17th of September and lasted 1 month and 8 days. It ended in his conviction of the only crimes of which the ecclesiastical court had jurisdiction, to wit, heresy, apostasy, and invocation of demons. The sentence was excommunication, which, we have seen, was lifted, and the final outcome of this trial was the repentance of Gilles de Rais. Now we turn to the process instituted by the civil tribunal for the trial of Gilles upon other charges than those which he was convicted by the ecclesiastical court. The usual close of the sentence of an ecclesiastical court, wherein the accused was charged with other crimes than those which the court had jurisdiction, would be, quote, "Go in peace. The church can no longer defend thee. She delivers thee to the secular arm," unquote. But this declaration was not made. It was useless, for it was well known to the judges that the civil court had already been organized and had taken cognizance and jurisdiction of the various crimes of Gilles, and as such had been charged and so well proved before the ecclesiastical court. Chapter 6. The Trial before the Civil Court. Trial before the Civil Court. Depositions, conviction, and sentence. Upon the arrest of Gilles and his henchmen, and during their trial before the ecclesiastical court, the army of retainers which had been employed by him, including his chapel and all his familiars, fled as would a flock of young chickens on the approach of a hawk. Francois Prelati, Eustache Blanchet, Henriette, Griard, and Poitou seem to have been all who were arrested with Gilles. Gilles de Sille and Roger de Briqueville had fled to the south before the blow fell. The rest got under cover as quickly as possible. Instead of standing by their master, they got as far away from him as they could. Gilles was the only one tried by the ecclesiastical tribunal. No particular reason was given why Francois and Blanchet were not tried with him, for they were undoubtedly guilty, equally with Gilles, of the charges of sorcery and invocation of demons. But they were priests, one of them an Italian priest, and whether they were promised freedom in consideration of their testimony against Gilles is now unknown. When on the 19th of October it had been decided by the ecclesiastical court to apply the torture to Gilles, it was done on the confessions of his accomplices. Why Francois Prelati and Eustache Blanchet have been excused or overlooked is, as has been said, unknown. But Henriette, Griard, and Poitou were then delivered to the civil court for trial. This civil court was presided over by Pierre de l'Hospital, who, as has been said, had assisted in the ecclesiastical court and was necessarily officially cognizant of the developments. Pierre de l'Hospital was the Chief Justice of the Duchy of Brittany, and the civil courts were under his authority. So immediately after the confessions of Henriette and Poitou, they were transferred to the civil authorities, and Pierre de l'Hospital, the supreme judge, brought them before the court on the 20th or 21st of October. The civil court had its session at the Buffet, then, and until 1848, the Palais de Justice. The Buffet had been a castle, and had been reconstructed and used as the Palais de Justice during many centuries. It was in proximity to the Chateau de Nantes. It was enclosed in a high wall, possibly to make a jail yard, and occupied the present place or market, Buffet. It was within this palace yard that the celebrated trial by duel took place, by direction or authority of the Duke of Brittany, between Count Robert Beaumanoir and Sieur Pierre Tournemine on a charge of murder made by the former against the latter. The castle or palace had been destroyed, as well as the wall, and it now stands all open. One side of the place abuts the river Loire, adjoining the bridge de la Poissonnière, over which the prisoners were taken to the Prairie Madeleine, the place of execution. The proceedings of the civil court need not be followed in their details. Preparing for the trial, as is the custom of criminal courts in France, the prosecutor called the witnesses before him and took down their depositions, and it is worthwhile to pause and examine the record as it appears in the archives of the Department of Law Inferior. The records of the two trials, the ecclesiastical and the civil, on file in the departmental archives, are unequal in the extent and detail with which they have been respectively reported. It is to be explained that it is a considerable work, and scarcely possible to have been completed in all its parts as the trial progressed, without immense labor on the part of the clerks and notaries. The proceedings of the ecclesiastical court, reported in Latin, comprise 308 pages, of which the photograph on page 137 of this memoir is a sample. The proceedings of the civil court in French comprise 109 pages, the two together making 420 pages in parchment, without including the sentence, which was in Latin, much mixed with French. The sentence is about the size of the original Declaration of Independence of the United States. It is said to have written in its entirety in a single night, and inspection of it corroborates the story, for it bears evidence, by way of erasures and interlineations, of haste and rapid work. The report of the evidence in the ecclesiastical trial is not nearly so satisfactory, nor has it been recorded so clearly and with so much detail. as was in the civil court. It is also much more convenient to render of that civil trial, therefore used it in making a transcript. It must not be forgotten that the evidence was taken by deposition out of court, that it was rendered not in the language of the witness but of the scribe. The depositions were not signed by the witnesses, but were reported to the court under the signature of the notary or commissioner. 86 witnesses were examined, and their testimony appears to have been reduced to writing by Jean Collin and certified by Jean de Toucheronde. The dates of the various sessions are not given, but each witness, or each batch of witnesses, appears to have been examined independently and certified to separately. This examination of witnesses in the civil courts seems to have begun about as early as did that in the ecclesiastical trial, for the first record is under date of September 18, 1440. For the purpose of showing the style of the French language in that use, it may be compared with modern French, changes noted. Before reporting the testimony and the depositions against Gilles de Rais, and that it may be better understood, it should be explained that there were two methods pursued by Gilles in the abduction of children. One, the secret and forcible abduction, and the other, the hiring of the child for service as a page, or his being taken with the consent of the parents on a pretended duty, by which he should be attached to the retinue of the baron. Both systems were pursued, and, it is believed, always by the followers and familiars of the baron, for it does not appear that he was ever personally engaged in either. The demand of the parent for the presence of the child was always put off by indefinite statements. The boy was at another chateau, or he had gone with the masters or men-at-arms, and would be absent for an indefinite time. Sometimes that he had gone to a distant province, other times that he had fled and was a fugitive, and they knew not his whereabouts. These were all equivocal responses, and far from satisfactory to the demanders, but out of them there grew the reports circulated throughout the country. On the trial, Henri, Griart, and Poitou made no defense but pleaded guilty. They confessed openly their crime, and being pushed to detail, they admitted that they had been concerned in the abduction of more than 50 children, and Henriette added that during his last trip to Jocelyn with Gilles de Retz, they had captured 3 of them with his own hands. The confession of Henri and of Coriolde, called Poitou, appears in the records, and following it on October 23rd is the condemnation by the civil court under Pierre de l'Hospital as follows, quote, "After the confession of the aforesaid Henri and Poitou, and on the advice of the assistants, advocates, and others heard in the case, and considering all the facts, it was adjudged and declared by the aforesaid Seigneur the President that the aforesaid Henri and Poitou should, and ought to be, hung and burned. But the execution of the sentence was postponed to await the conclusion of the trial of Gilles before the ecclesiastical court. On the 25th of October, Gilles' sentence was passed upon him by the ecclesiastical court, and he was turned over to the civil court. He was delivered to the prison at Bouffay on the same evening, and the next morning was brought before the civil court, with Pierre l'Hospital as supreme judge. All hope of escape was lost to Gilles, and like his accomplices, he seemed to be more interested for the salvation of his soul than care for his body. He made no defense. Indeed, defense was useless, for the trial was only a formality. Being charged with the crime of murder and interrogated as to the facts, he repeated his confession of guilt. In the consultation of the court as to the sentence, there were some differences of opinion among the judges. That he merited death there was no question, and that appears to have been accepted by all. But as to the manner of death and the degree of odium to be attached thereto, there was some debate. However, as he had been excommunicated by the church, and his accomplices had already been sentenced, and as the crime shocked all the world who knew of it, the argument prevailed that as Gilles had been the chief promoter, and as he and his 2 accomplices had been together in the crimes, they should not be separated in their punishments. Therefore, first, a fine should be upon him of 50,000 pounds, and second, he should be hung and burned alive on the gibbet in Pièce. Pièce was a little open prairie on the island of La Madeleine in the river opposite, forming the part of the city of Nantes. It was reached by 2 bridges communicating with the place Bouffray. Pierre de l'Hospital, in pronouncing the sentence upon Gilles, concluded, quote, "You have not to rely upon now but the mercy of God. I ask you so to dispose yourself as to die in good state, and to seek repentance for having committed such great crimes. Tomorrow at 1 o'clock, the sentence against you will be carried into effect." Gilles preferred 3 petitions through the judge to the bishop. One, that the execution of the three, himself and his two servants, should be at one and the same time, to end that he might comfort and aid them by his presence upon that dread occasion, that they should see that his execution actually took place, and should not be tormented with the thought that either his wealth or power could procure the postponement of the execution, and finally, or possibly, a pardon. The second was that his ashes might be buried in consecrated ground, and when this prayer was granted, he chose the Carmelite church at Nantes. The third was that on the day of the execution, a procession of litany, such as was common in that country, should be organized to make prayers to God for him and his two servants, that they might be sustained and supported in their repentance, and that their salvation might be assured. Accordingly, on the morrow, at 9 o'clock, this procession was organized and marched through the streets of the city in the most solemn manner, headed by the clergy of all ranks, reciting the prayers for the dead. Chapter 7. The Execution. On October 26, 1440, at 11 o'clock, the time fixed, the procession approached the prison Bouffay. Gilles, Henriet, and Poitou were brought out, and with this long procession for an escort, were conducted across the two bridges to the place of execution. The two courts, ecclesiastical and civil, were present, and it has been said that the Duke of Brittany was also present. 3 gibbets had been erected with their cross arms, and at the foot of each a pile of wood was laid. It is needless to describe the details of the execution. Some of them may be apocryphal. They were not recorded at the time, and they may have been made for the occasion. In any event, they had nothing to the strength of the story. It seems agreed, however, that at the given signal the 3 malefactors were suspended by ropes from the gibbets, and that the wood was fired, and that they were hung and burned at the same time, that they died with words of repentance on their lips, expressions of hope for pardon from the God whom they had offended, and stating their hopes and beliefs of salvation. There was no sermon, no reading of sentences, no prolongation of agony. Prayers for the dead were continually recited, but the execution proceeded with as much rapidity as possible. The historians of the day, Monstrelet, Chartier, Argentre, all agree that the body of Gilles was rescued from the flames before it was burned to ashes, and enclosed in a coffin and carried to the church of the Carmelites at Nantes, where it was buried privately without ceremony, while the ashes of the 2 accomplices were scattered to the winds of heaven and the waves of the Loire. This was the punishment of Gilles de Rais, and this the expiation of his crimes. It is curious to remark its effect on human nature and how it was regarded by the people. If Gilles de Rais had escaped the punishment of his crimes, the whole country would have been in arms. He would have been denounced in the fiercest terms as the most execrable of human beings. But after having suffered this terrible punishment before the eyes of all men, and it was thus made known throughout the country, the spirit of hate and vengeance seemed to have turned to pity, and sorrow and grief seemed to have taken their places. In commemoration of his sufferings, an altar was erected in his memory and to his name upon the spot where he died. A niche was made for the reception of a statue, though none appears to have been erected, and, unexplainable as it is, almost marvelous, it came in after years to be called the altar of the Bonne Vierge de Crueillet. The spot where was executed this man, who had decimated Brittany by the abduction and murder of its infants, came in a superstitious manner to be esteemed as a place of value in furnishing milk for nursing mothers. Offerings of flowers and similar objects were frequently placed upon the altar to secure the good offices of Saint Anne, who was supposed to have it in charge. This is evidence not only of the instability of the judgment of the multitude and the changeableness of the public, but the elusiveness of and want of dependence on tradition. The family of Gilles seemed to have made no demonstration, not even in appearance, during this trying time. No record or mention is made of their presence at the trial, or of any interest therein. His widow married within the year, and his daughter Marie, then about 15 years of age, married within 2 years after his death. His widow married Jean Vendôme, and the daughter's first husband was Préjet Coiteville, Admiral of France. These united in a memoir addressed to the King of France to save the property that had belonged to Gilles de Rais from confiscation by the Duke of Brittany. Préjet was killed on June 20th, 1450, during the siege of Cherbourg by a cannon shot. His widow married for a second husband, André Laval, her cousin. She died without issue in 1457 and was buried in the church of Notre Dame at Vitre. René de la Suze, brother of Gilles, married Anne de Champagne. He left a daughter, Jeanne de Retz, who married Francois Chauvigny, the Prince of Dieul, April 11, 1446. They had one child, a son, who died unmarried in 1502. And thus, within 62 years after the death of Gilles de Rais, his family became extinct. The end.